He who goes about to reform the world must begin with himself, or he loses his labor. St. Ignatius of Loyola. Bending, Not Breaking. The Dragon Prince Edition. Book 2. Sky. All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Bending, Not Breaking. I am so excited we are here. This is going to be a fun, different kind of episode, and I'm really excited to kind of dive into it. But before we talk about what we're going to do, I want to introduce one of our guests. And then by one of our guests, I mean our only guest for this episode, because we only have one. So let me tell you a little bit about who we got. His name is Trevor Warren, and he is in Duke Divinity School as a seminarian, and he is in school with me, which is kind of fun. And he is in the process of becoming ordained with the UMC, which is the United Methodist Church. He's a filmmaker, he's a creative, and he is a co-host of his own podcast called Just Us, which explores the intersections of faith, justice, and contemporary culture. He's a pretty niche Methodist kind of nerdy man, and it's wonderful because I'm glad he's here with us because it's going to be really helpful for what we're doing on today's episode. So Trevor, welcome to the podcast. How are you feeling right now? What's going on?
Man, let me tell you, honored would be an understatement of how I feel being here. I'm really excited. When we first met, I heard, one of the first things I heard you is like introducing yourself is that you had a podcast that talked about, Avatar and Legend of Korra. And I was like, oh my gosh, those shows literally shaped me, growing up. I remember sitting in my grandparents' house, like watching as a 12-year-old boy, these shows and really looking back at how much they like shaped me, even though I didn't really realize at the time. And I was like, well, this is someone I obviously have to be friends with. So
and lo and behold, a lot of our classes were together. We ended up in the same like group me where we have the same friend group. It's pretty neat.
I know. It's obviously the universe wants us to be doing this right now.
Goodness, so. Right? Yeah, it's like everything has been leading to this moment, right?
Exactly. This is the highlight of my life so far. So
okay, well, thank you for agreeing to join me. I hear it's an honor, but it's an honor that you're joining us because I'm excited to kind of share what we got going and what we have planned on this episode with our listeners. I think that they will enjoy it. At least some of them will, right? And we can't always please everybody, but if we get a couple, it's always a win. So before we dive in, Trevor, can you just give us a little bit of maybe what's the snapshot? What's the summary of how you got to what led you to be in seminary at Duke? Like what brought you to this point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I started feeling a call to ministry when I was about like 16. And this just kind of give you like context for what kind of brought me here. But I spent a lot of time really wrestling with a lot of questions, that I just kind of took for granted in the church. My mom got chronic illness when I was real young, like 6th grade. And, I remember that was the first time I really started questioning, like, why are these bad things happening? And so a lot of my interest in like theology and kind of the theological education was kind of my attempt to kind of come to terms with a lot of those questions. And on the way, as I was like reflecting on a lot of these issues of like, what's the relationship between science and religion? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do some people go to hell, for eternity, and some people go to heaven? And, these were things I was really struggling with. And so I saw, approaching seminary, though I wasn't always necessarily Duke, how I approached it was very much of like a way to reconcile a lot of these issues. And I just, on the way and reflecting on it, I encountered a lot of people that went to Duke, a lot of important people in my life. And it, over time, just kind of felt like the place I needed to be. And it's interesting because I'm definitely, especially as I interacted with a lot of people at Duke, they kind of reframed a lot of my concerns from trying to intellectualize and figure out the problems present in religion and Christianity, to making me see it much more as like a invitation to participate in the mystery, that is.
Ooh, I love that language. I love that
Yeah,
language.
and I think that's such a, especially my culture coming from like South, Northeast Texas, very evangelical, conservative, socially conservative culture. It was very much this idea of like spirituality is something you have to figure out in your head. You have to figure out all these specific beliefs. And if you don't have the right understanding, you may or may not burn in hell for eternity,
Yeah.
And so, but if you look at traditional spirituality, and especially in my Methodist tradition, there's a lot more to that. That it's less about intellectualizing and much more participating in the language and practices of our specific tradition in order to help us understand what all this is to the best of our ability. So that's a long way of saying how I got to Duke. And also, Duke just offered me a good scholarship money too.
Yeah,
so,
same, 100% same.
Right.
There's no way I would be
People
able to
forget
go.
that. People forget, like, I'm going to be completely honest, money did play a factor in that. So.
Oh, 100% for me too. There is zero chance I would be able to be at Duke without a significant help. So thankfully that came along. So let me ask you this. It's always interesting grappling with people who have a foundation in any particular religion. And then I come up to them and say, yeah, I'm treating, Avatar: The Last Airbender and the Dragon Prince as sacred. And I usually get one of two looks. One of the looks is like super judgy and being like, and I just get this, I can't, like, it doesn't translate on a podcast. I just made a face, but it's like I get this judgy look. And then I get like, it gets kind of quiet and be like, well, what do you mean? Like, and it's just like this, especially when that comes up at Duke. There are some people who I get that vibe. And then there's a whole opposite group of like, oh, wow, that's so cool. Tell me more. What do you mean when you say that? And then they're just like really curious. And what is your reflection on treating coming from a Christian perspective, treating something other than the Bible as sacred? How does that feel to you? What is that like to you? Give me the rundown.
Yeah, as I kind of think about your question, I'm kind of reminded of our Old Testament class, both me and your Old Testament class that we took this past year with Dr. Brent Strawn at Duke. And I really appreciated the analogy that he kind of started off the semester with, kind of our first lesson, which was this idea that not just the Old Testament, but the Bible, Scripture in general, is this sort of language. And I would go even farther to say that every part of the Christian tradition, be it doctrine, dogma, liturgy, anything like that is a sort of language rooted in Scripture, though not necessarily always. But it is all of it together kind of creates this language that we are using to interpret the reality that we have experienced of the world and that those who came before us experienced. And so thinking like that, I think that's a helpful way for getting at the core of your question, because I think too often we look at, especially the Bible itself as good old sola scriptura, Protestants, Scripture alone. This idea that the Bible and even to an extent like doctrine, dogma, all these different things that we kind of hold as authoritative are not necessarily the objects of our faith in themselves, but are more parts of this language that we're using to tell this story. This story that we see narrated through Scripture. And don't get me wrong, like I think Scripture is an important narrative and offers at least for me, a very detailed and holistic narrative of, what the world was, is, and could be. But I also recognize that there is a degree to which language is going to fall short. And because language is descriptive, that means that the language we're using itself is not necessarily the truth that we are talking about, that it's talking about the truth. And when you look at it that way, you're able to see that even if there are other things that are saying the same thing, other languages that are, on the surface may look different, if you look closely, a lot of them are saying the same thing. And so when I look at things like Avatar, or, even things like Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, even, different forms of literature, I don't have a huge problem with looking at them in a similarly spiritual way, because if the truth lines up with the truth that I find in Scripture, that is truth. We're both using language to talk about truth, and just because I use a different language to, identify it, doesn't mean that it can't be identified with another truth. So I think that's a very important thing for us as post-Enlightenment, not just Christians, but post-Enlightenment Americans, Westerners especially, to kind of realize in order to really understand what spirituality is about. And the fact that, we don't know what's going on. We only have our language to best tell what's going on, but the language itself is not the object of what we claim to be true. It is a way of helping us describe the world and understand the world and the reality that we find ourselves in. But it can also be shared and, and translated in other ways. So yeah, I think that's how I look at it.
It is a fallible experience, right? Our attempts at communication with language.
Exactly.
And I think that can be lifted up just by the sense of like, there are so many words that are in other languages that are not in English, right? There are words in German that don't exist in English. There are words in Japanese that don't exist in English. And it's the same way when we try to communicate with a fallible language, there's going to be something left to be desired. Mm-hmm. And it's just an interesting way to think about it. And I love that kind of comparison, because I think language is a really unique thing. And it's really funny because, I have a love-hate relationship with Strawn, and it's one of those things where I'm probably going to be referencing him more than once today. Speaking of which, another thing that came up in that class was about how to approach a sacred text. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that he preaches about, one of the things he mentions and lifts up multiple times was that, it's more about how we are engaging it than it is about what we are engaging. And one of the things he lifted up a lot was the idea of you have to read it. You have to read it again. You have to read it slowly, and then you have to read it again slowly. And then there's probably another read some way, shape, or form. I'm forgetting what it was. He usually has things grouped in 4, right? But just the idea that it's when we read it slowly and repeatedly and with focus, that kind of effort, honestly, is what makes the text or whatever we're engaging more sacred, right? It's not that the text itself is not necessarily sacred, but how we engage with it and the way that we treat it is what makes it sacred. And so I think that that's something that resonated with me as I learned that and as I engaged with it, because I was like, oh, I'm just going to apply this over here. Does that resonate with you too? Is that something?
Yeah, no, that totally resonates. And just to talk a little theologically, because that's the language I'm most fluent in. The Bible and our encounters with Scripture isn't necessarily about what the Bible itself is doing, what the text itself, but what for us as Christians, what God through the Holy Spirit is doing. And so it's about really making ourselves aware to a presence that is already there within the words that may change every single time, and how those words are used by the divine to bring us into new experiences and to help us encounter truths in ways that we didn't really necessarily experience before. And I think that's what's so cool about Lectio Divina, the practice that we, took part in that class, is that it allowed you to encounter the text in a way that was less about you searching for these ideas and specific, points that were made in the text using like critical methods, but specifically it was about how do we read it in a way that we are receptive to God's encounter with us in the text, and thus through that being able to be shaped and molded accordingly. I truly believe that can be done, through any work of art, through any work of creativity. Obviously for me, because I have the scriptural narrative as kind of my base understanding of reality, it all connects back to that, but that doesn't mean I can't experience, God speaking to me in other places, in other forms of literature, and because, spirituality, like I said, is just a language. So yeah, I totally agree.
Sweet. Well, I'm glad we agree because, we're going to do it.
Perfect.
Yeah, and I think the only other thing that I want to lift up about what a sacred text is that, it's when we engage with something where we are assuming that it is more than entertainment, right? Mm-hmm. Like we don't just read the Bible for fun, or we don't read the Quran let's just go read this for fun, right? We are seeking something from it. And it like if taken seriously, theoretically, we can gain something, we can reap the benefits, and theoretically there are rewards to fruit to pick, if you will, that is growing there if we let it appear to us. And so I think one of the things that is really integral to this is that when we treat something as sacred, it does not mean that we believe that it is infallible. Mm-hmm. And that goes for the Bible as well as it does for anything that we might be engaging, whether it be the Dragon Prince or another fiction novel or Avatar, right? It's not that it is infallible. It's that it is going to be beneficial for us in our construction, in our growth, in our moral development, if we give it that attention and that contemplation. Does that make, how do we feel about that?
Absolutely. And I think there's a sense in like, even in the presence of those fallibilities in the text, just look at the Old Testament, there's a lot of them, from violence to treatment of women, to genocide at times. Those are present and there. And I don't necessarily think that every reading should have to, look at those as, oh, well, it's there, that's okay, that's not how it's supposed to be. But there is a sense, I think, like even in those fallibilities that, we're still able to be shaped by the divine in that. For if you see, treatment of women or women being treated, I know a lot of feminist scholars, biblical scholars will look at that and say, hey, let's look at this, woman's experience as a, lesson, as something to look at. And so I think a lot of times, when we encounter these texts, then the fallibilities might be just what, we're supposed to see, and to recognize those as fallibilities and in a sense, be shaped by that. And so, yeah, I totally see that.
I think it's still super valuable though, right? It's one of those things where when we begin to, anytime anything becomes certain, I believe that we have
learned. No, yeah, exactly. And for me, that's, if you go into the text with some sort of agenda, with some sort of expectations of what you're going to find, kind of in the same way, even doing like, exegesis where you're like critically examining the text, that's not really, those are helpful, but that's not really it's not having a spiritual encounter with the text. And it requires a sense of humility, honestly, to come into the text, sort of emptying oneself out and to just be led by the text for all its, warts and all, whatever fallibilities are present, acknowledging those, but being open to the possibility, even if you don't affirm them, there may be still a way that we are able to be shaped and formed in the presence of those fallibilities, in a way, if anything, just to acknowledge that they are there.
Well, thank you for kind of indulging me in this conversation, because we haven't really we've kind of brushed up against this conversation on the main feed of the podcast, but we've never really grappled with what this means. And so I'm glad that our listeners will have this as kind of a resource to kind of at least get a sense of where we on the podcast are coming from when it comes to how we're approaching the things that we are covering on the podcast.
Absolutely.
Okay. Before we get into the nitty gritty of the show, I want to make sure that we give everyone a chance to remember what's going down in this season of The Dragon Prince in book 2. And so in order for us to do that, I have warned you and subjected you to the fact that you will be responsible for a season recap, and you will only have 45 seconds. How do you feel about that?
Terrified, but ready. You know, I have the hope of Jesus on my side. So let's do this. Let's do this. Spirit is with me.
That's what's going to help you do better than me. Dang. All right. Let me get ready with a nice little timer.
All right.
On your mark, get set. 45 seconds. Go.
All right, so Zim has been born. Callum wants to learn magic, but he's being told he can't. Whereas Ezra is trying to teach them how to fly. You have Callum and Claudia show up, and they're acting all happy and friends, but secretly they're trying to get them back. Everyone's cool with it except Rayla, because she kind of suspects something going on. Eventually, she reveals that after Claudia reveals to Callum that his dad's dead, and he's really upset, doesn't know how he's going to tell Ezrin. Then they are run away from Claudia and Soren, find a pirate with no eyes who teaches him about his experience sailing, and how Callum is trying to use that to understand the Sky Arcana. Meanwhile, you have Viren, who is found playing with this mirror, but isn't real sure about it. So he decides to go and have a council with the kingdoms, but it doesn't work out. He comes back and gives over to the so close, man.
There is so much going down.
Oh man, yeah, I'm telling you, jeez,
man. Well,
I feel like any faster, I would have just like passed out. Honestly,
it's like
exactly.
All right. Well, you got most of it. I don't even know if I need to do it. I thought you did a really good job.
I feel like I at least got to like the halfway point.
For sure. Yeah. Okay. There's a few things that you did leave out, so I want to try and get to them. All right. I'm gonna give myself a countdown. Let me do. Oh god, maybe here we go. Okay. Let me do it on my, there we go. Okay, now we're talking. All right, on my mark, get set, go. Okay. So Callum starts the season with some moon magic, and he's like, Zim can't fly, and then Claudia and Soren try to convince the boys to go back, and then Rayla's like, illusion trap, and then they fly away on Fifi, and then Fifi falls out of the sky because, there's no moon, and then there's like a pirate Velas, and then there's, no eyes, like you said, and then there's across the sea, and the Sky Arcanum stuff happens, and then there's the summit of the 5 kingdoms, and then Viren mansplains a little bit, and then flashbacks of Sarai and Harrow, and they kill the Magma Titan, and they feed a bunch of people, and then, Sarai dies conspicuously, and then Soren fights a dragon, and Viren's like been doing pretty sus stuff with the mirror, and then Viren, all the things, Callum, dark magic price, nightmares, Ezra's dad dies, returns Catullus, and then wake up with primal magic urges.
I think you did it.
Primal magic urges. Primal urges? How do we feel about that? That's an interesting little, okay. What it is.
It's a fantasy world. Sure, primal urges.
Nightmare or something else. Anyway, okay, I digress. All right, well, that was fun. We got a chance to give everybody a little bit of what's going on. 45 seconds is longer, but also not nearly enough to do a full season. Anyway, okay, cool. All right, well, we're going to dive into the rest of our fun stuff then. but we are going to tackle a sacred practice. And the first practice that we are tackling today is the thing called Lectio Divina. And we've talked about it before. We've done it before on the podcast. But Trevor, do you mind, with your kind of understanding and your background, which is a little bit more extensive than I, can you give us just a brief, like, what is a Lectio Divina and like what does that mean? And if you remember and recall, where does that come from and what's it rooted in?
Yeah, so it's basically Latin for sacred reading, and it is a traditional practice of reading scripture that has a lot of ties with the early monastic movements in Christianity, which was a way of not just studying the scripture, from a very intellectual, like, I get this point, I take this critical analysis to make this sense of this text, but it's more of like an encounter with God in scripture, or the encounter with the mystery, if you will, and a way to be able to be shaped by it that isn't always going to be the same each time you encounter it, and that's kind of like where we get into this idea of like the living nature of scripture, and Lectio Divina is really the epitome of that, because it sees scripture as less of a static document of truth that you have to follow and check boxes off and to make sense of, but it's an encounter with the divine that you be able to gain something new each time you participate in it.
Yeah.
And by doing that, you're ultimately being shaped and brought closer to union with God and to one another. And so I love it, and especially as someone who so often, especially in seminary, where we're having to do a lot of critical analyses of text, and looking at the historical context and the literary form, and the contextual analysis, it gets hard to not look at scripture that way all the time.
I think one of the things that was a unique experience for me is that I have an interesting relationship with prayer as a general rule. I don't know how I feel about it at any given time. It changes and ebbs and flows. But one of the things that I realized, and that I was kind of like, there was insight brought to me while we were doing Lectio Divina as an exercise for class, that Lectio Divina is a form of prayer. And that's something that was like, oh, prayer isn't always, dear God. Like, it's like, it doesn't, like, it has a completely different format. And I think when I reframe this exercise and say the way that we're doing this is a form of prayer, all of a sudden I feel like prayer is way more accessible to me. And so I find that to be just something worth noting for people who are listening and are curious. But yeah, I kind of, from my understanding, the Lectio Divina that I kind of understand and where it came from, I think it was Guido II who talked about the ladder of monks, and there were 4 rungs on the ladder, and essentially that was the kind of the beginning of Lectio Divina. And I talked about those 4 rungs, and that kind of translates into these 4 steps that we will engage with together. And so what we'll do is we'll kind of get started. But in order to do that, I'm going to need your help. I have transcripts pulled up, and we're gonna do this the right way. We're not gonna pick a quote that we picked. We're gonna pick a random one. And so what we're going to do is, I have this pulled up, and I want you to give me, I'm going to give you a number, which is going to be episodes 1 through 9. Then I'm going to pick that one. Then I'm going to dive into that episode. I'm going to give you another number, and then we're going to whittle down all until we get one quote. Are you ready?
No, but sure.
Okay, here we go. This is Grin speaking. Welcome back. I hope you had a pleasant trip. I'll read it one more time. Welcome back. I hope you had a pleasant trip. So step 1 of Lectio Divina, in the way that we process it on the podcast, is step 1 is, what is literally going on in the text right now? And so do you happen to recall in episode 7 what is going on when Grin says, welcome back, I hope you had a pleasant trip?
Well, that was like when Viren had gotten rejected by the Kingdom Summit and was all in a sour, depressed mood, and just sees Grin all cheery hanging in the dungeon, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Viren responds with like something along the lines of like, how are you so cheerful? Yeah, and that's just Grin, right? So welcome back. I hope you had a pleasant trip. Well, congratulations, Trevor. Step one is like you nailed it. That's it. We got it.
$30,000 of seminary education at work.
Look at what Duke is paying for. Look at that. So we're moving on to step 2 already, which is great. So step 2, this is where we start getting interesting. And so I want to figure out the allegory here. And so what is the allegorical, what does it remind you of in both the rest of the Dragon Prince, any moments in the Dragon Prince that we have seen, but also allegory in other works of fiction, other works, other stories that we know of. So I'm going to read it one more time and let us think for a second. Welcome back. I hope you had a pleasant trip.
Yeah. So, yeah, you mentioned at the beginning, I'm have a filmmaking background, and that entails a lot of narrative, study of narrative and structure and script writing and all that jazz. And so I definitely look at this. I like to look at characters a lot of times as like on their own hero's journey. And in Viren's case, he has been on this journey, and went on this journey that kind of climaxed with this, or what he thought would be climaxed with this, summit where he'd finally get what he wants, and finally have the ability to fulfill his story, but it didn't work out. And then he gets back and he's told he's removed from the council, and it's just, he's at like, rock bottom in a sense. And he encounters Grin just hanging there, and kind of ironically is asking him, or Grin is asking him, well, have a good trip? Well, obviously not, but it's like literally he feels like his life is over. Viren feels like his life is over. I've literally done everything I possibly could. There's no hope.
It's like no, Grin, read the room.
Exactly. And we know that after this, that's kind of the point where he goes and basically, sells his soul to the Mirror Man, the mysterious mirror, and which is, in my opinion, kind of like the equivalent of, going to see the puppy in the van. Like, why not? Everything else is ruined. What could this hurt? I've lost everything. Couldn't get much worse. And so that's kind of like a turning point in his own story, and it kind of shows just how low at a point he is.
Wow, I love that. I think that's so interesting that you kind of lift up that irony piece, because I went in a similar vein, but I went in the sarcasm. I know Grin here is not being sarcastic, or at least I don't think he is. But I immediately went to like Rayla, who is so acerbic with her language, and she's so sarcastic, and it comes in, and had anyone else said this, I would have heard it as sarcasm. But for Grin, it was like, no, I genuinely hope you had a pleasant trip. Like, I was like, I hope that was great. I hope it was wonderful.
Well, and doesn't he like afterwards say something along the lines of like, I could see myself as shackled down, or I could see myself as shackled up.
Right?
It's like the kind of guy just Grin is.
And it's interesting because I wonder what his relationship with Viren would be if he did respond, if he wasn't so optimistic. I wonder if he might have more. I wonder if he'd be able to convince Viren a little bit better if he wasn't so optimistic. I don't know, but like maybe not, because Viren's probably going to keep him there regardless. But it makes me wonder what that would be like if he weren't so optimistic.
Yeah, you could definitely see him as like a little bit, too optimistic. But I do think, I also see, for me, with this scene is it kind of sets up a contrast between Viren and Grin, especially like how similar their situations are. If you think about it, like Grin's, journey has obviously hit a bit of a snag in the sense that he, is now in a dungeon chained up and was doing everything fine. And then you have Viren, who, we talk about how things weren't going his way, and it's kind of his rock bottom, and you see these kind of differing approaches to responding to that, and I would like to think, Grin kind of, for me at least, shows the proper way to look at it. You can't change what happened, but you can change your outlook on it, and maintain a sense of optimism and hope to keep you pushing forward. Or you can be like Viren and just give up, and just be like, well, I just gotta, go darker even, and I will literally do whatever it takes to get back where I was, rather than the sort of release and acceptance that Grin has.
Ah, man. Okay. So step 2 is this allegory, right? Where do we see moments like this? What does this remind me of in other moments in the show, but also outside of the show? Is there a moment outside of the show, outside of the Dragon Prince, that this reminds you of? I'll read it one more time for you. Mm-hmm. Welcome back. I hope you had a pleasant trip.
Yeah, I guess the thing that kind of comes to my mind is, I mentioned towards the beginning that, when I was really young, my mom was diagnosed with some pretty serious chronic illness stuff, and that was a really hard time for me. And I was real active in church, and I remember thinking that, and in my interactions with a lot of people in the church, of feeling like a sense of over optimism, over sentimentality towards it. You hear a lot of things. Oh, don't worry, God is in control, or God's going to get this okay, make this okay, and everything's going to be all right, and there's always hope. And a lot of times it made me feel a little like Viren did, like, just eye roll. And kind of thinking, oh, well, they just don't really understand the gravity of this situation of how I feel, and just like how this, serious this is. I mean, I had a whole life planned, and that's probably a problem on my end, planning your life up to, adulthood when you're like 13. But, I had this whole idea of where I was going, and a lot of my mom's sickness, especially as the years kind of unfolded, was directly a part of those plans kind of changing. And so I was very much feeling this sense of like no direction, and feeling like I was at rock bottom, and definitely at times could see myself approaching that sort of darkness that Viren had, in the sense that I wasn't, holding on to a hope that everything was going to be better. And thankfully I did. And to this day, I've become just, I'm oftentimes just blown away with how, wrong I was in terms of how my life would be now, thinking it was going to be, just awful if it didn't meet the plans I had. And it wasn't until I embraced that sort of optimism and that sort of hope that, even though I couldn't see it, telling myself it's there, that I was actually able to see, there is actually hope in all this. And so for me, seeing all these grins telling me that, at the same, even though at the time I didn't, necessarily accept what they were saying and kind of roll my eyes what they were saying, it did give me a sense of feeling like, okay, well, maybe there is maybe this isn't as bad as it is going to get. Maybe there is a light down the end of the tunnel, and so that's kind of what I come up with.
That was honestly a perfect segue into kind of step 3. And so step 2 is this allegory in terms of going into other moments in like other works, right? And then step 3 is how do we reflect on this in our own lives? And what you just gave was just a perfect example of that, what that optimism can do, right? Mm-hmm. Especially when it's not considering the circumstances of the person that we're speaking to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's a sense in like, Grin is aware of the situation. He understands the gravity of his situation, even though Viren, probably doesn't think he does. It's just kind of like, yeah, I'm hanging here and it looks like there's no hope, but I could either just sit here and just continue to plunge into darkness and hopelessness, or I can hold on to, something that can, give me some sense of hope, that I'll get out of here. because if I don't have that hope, then I definitely won't get out of here.
You know what this reminds me of in my life? Many of our listeners know who Sunshine is. He's my co-host for the main segment of the podcast. And Sunshine is a really interesting person because he often will say things that, like, if I said them, it would come across as really sarcastic. But when he says them, like he says them and I'm like, are you being sarcastic? And he's like, and he almost always will, like 3 seconds later, be like, I'm not being sarcastic. I meant that. And that's kind of what this reminds me of. He's like, sometimes he'll say things that, like, clearly I'm having like a day. He's like, I hope you have the great rest of your day. And like, I'm like, and I give him a look and he's like, no, I actually meant that. I hope you do. Like, and it's like, because it's always comes across at really interesting times. And when, like, I'm just like, I can't tell if he's being sarcastic or not. And that's kind of where I am here. It's like, if I were living in Viren's shoes at this moment, I'd be like, how can you possibly see me, see my face, see how I'm feeling right now, and then say that to me? Yeah. But at the same time, it really makes me feel a little bit more gracious, like, right? Because I also honestly believe that Bryn means this fully, like, right? And so at the same time, I'm like, okay, but like, is it me who needs to change here, or is it Bryn? And in my mind, it's me, because I'm the one who's receiving this and being like, there's no way you're being serious, or like, read the room, or like, but it's me who's having that reaction. It's not like Grin is being nice and I am judging his niceness. And so, and I feel like I've done that before with Sunshine. And so I'm kind of grappling with that, and like, I'm like, oh dear, maybe I need to got to check myself before I wreck myself a little bit. What else? Anything else for step 3? Any other life things that this reminds us of? I'll read it one more time. Welcome back. I hope you had a pleasant trip.
Kind of as you last talked, I thought of Viren a little bit more. So this may be a little, outside of the scope, but
yeah, no worries.
For me, another thing that I think about is being vulnerable is something that I've always like really wanted, just based on my personality. Like I'm an Enneagram 4 for any Enneagram fans, out there. And there is this desire in me to be super emotionally connected with people and to be able to show people your true self. And but a lot of times, because of how people responded to me and how the world would respond to that and abuse it a lot of times, it kind of creates this shell around you, and it did for me specifically. And I can't help but, when hearing, how Grin's talking to him and how Viren must be feeling in response, I think Viren's big thing is a fear of vulnerability. And I think that's a big theme throughout the Dragon Prince, is this sort of, fear of a vulnerability, because the world is a bad place. It's only going to hurt you. It's only going to
dragons, they're going to kill you.
Exactly, and there's a sense in where Grin is showing a bit of vulnerability in his optimism,
Oh, that's so true.
And like Viren just can't comprehend that, because for him, you have to be strong, you have to be powerful, you have to dominate your environment in order to have true strength, and anything outside of that is weakness. And I think I just, it's very hard. You have to read into it very deeply and think about the whole context. But there's a sense in where I think Viren, is feeling that way, and as Grin is responding to him, of like, wow, that's a very weak, vulnerable way of looking at things, but we know watching that that's actually where the strength is. And it's kind of why Viren's downfall kind of continues, why he becomes so much darker as the season progresses.
Yeah, man, that was really a light bulb went off for me. I was like, oh goodness, being positive is vulnerable. I was like, oh no, that's why I'm so negative all the time. I'm like, oh no, that's why I'm so critical. I was like, oh, that just went down a rabbit hole. That was like, oh dear. Oof. Okay. All right.
Well, I'm here to blow your mind, Ben.
Yeah, well, thanks for flipping that switch. I feel worse now. It's good. It's fine. I'll eat my feelings. It'll be great. Okay, so this kind of is a good segue again to step 4. Step 4 is this fourth rung on the ladder where we're climbing deeper and deeper into the text. Is what is an action step that this experience, that going through this process has led us to? What's something that you want to change or do based off of this conversation? And that's kind of like the goal is of step 4. And so what are your thoughts?
I mentioned the idea of like practice, practicing hope, and also the idea of vulnerability. And I for me, those are the two things I'm taking out of that. It's kind of like concrete actions that to, truly have hope and to truly be able to, have optimism in light of horrible things and happening, and the world not working out, or not acting in accordance with how we expect, that it requires both an act of vulnerability, so an act of surrender of, there is strength still in being optimistic, and it requires me to sort of let go of my desire to, dominate my environment and sort of try to find and sort of try to control, the things around me. And then it requires a sort of practice, a daily practice, I would argue, of telling yourself, hey, see myself as chained down, I'm actually chained up. That's something that's sort of a practice you have to do in order to create this real optimism, even if you don't necessarily feel it for yourself in the moment. Hope isn't just a feeling, it is a reality you have to live into. And it requires a sort of emptying of oneself and a vulnerability to experience that. And for me, that's kind of like, I guess, ethical application I get from this, is that to do anything really, to live any sort of life that is seeking union with the divine, requires that dual act of vulnerability and daily practice, and I would argue response to, what the grace that we are shown every day if we just look.
Yeah. Wow. No, that's beautiful. Oh, okay. I think what I heard from you that really spoke out the most was the idea that this is a practice. This isn't something you just start, like you just, I'm optimistic now, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be vulnerable now. It's like, it's a practice that must be practiced. It's not something that just happens. It's something that must become. So yeah. Okay. For me, I'll read it one more time just so everybody can have a good grasp on what we're going with. Welcome back. I hope you had a pleasant trip. As I grapple with an action step that this conversation is kind of guiding me to, I'm kind of really feeling this need to, when I am in negative Nancy mode, and what's a flag that can like help my self-awareness catch, to be like, is this how I want to engage with the world? And so, because like, and I wonder if the filter is, do I want to be a Viren or a Grin here? Do I want to be a Viren? And it's one of those things where I think my default is to be a Viren. And I would like for my default to be closer on the spectrum to Grin than it is now. And I think I'm hearing you, and I'm feeling similarly, in the sense that I want to start practicing what it would be like to become aware of, nope, that was a negative response. And by negative, I'm not necessarily meaning it is bad. I'm saying that it is judgmental or critical, or and unnecessarily critical or judgmental of the world. That's kind of where I'm coming from when I say negative. So how do I confront that and be like, oh, be aware. And I think that's the first step. I don't want to jump too far and say, I want to get to this point. I want to say my action step is to cultivate awareness around my judgment and my critical thinking, because sometimes I think it's too critical, and I just want to become a little bit more on sliding that scale. And I think the first step to do that is to cultivate a little bit more awareness around that.
Mm-hmm.
So just pausing and thinking a little bit more as I begin to experience a response. Oh man, well, that was our experience with Lectio Divina. That was one of our practices that we got to do today. We are going to come back and do another. So stay tuned. Here's some music for you, and we'll be right back. I hope that musical fun stuff tickled your ears a little bit. You're feeling nice and good. I don't know why I'm talking like this. All right, here we go. So we're back, and Trevor is still with us. And thankfully, because we are about to dive into some Ignatian spirituality practice with the Dragon Prince. And we have done this before, but not with the Dragon Prince. We've done this with a few of our Avatar episodes, but I'm excited because Trevor, you are somewhat of your niche expertise here. So I would love to get your help in explaining this next segment. What we're doing is we're calling it Sacred Imagination. But can you kind of give us some insight into Ignatian spirituality and maybe a little bit about its origins? And then we'll kind of dive into how we'll adapt that to the Dragon Prince.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I actually went to undergrad at a Jesuit college. So I know I'm going to say something and all my Jesuit professors are going to like, how dare you misrepresent Jesuit spirituality? So I apologize in advance, but
I hope they're all listening.
They're all listening to this podcast, I'm sure. But from what I was told and kind of my encounters with it is it goes back to St. Ignatius of Loyola, who, for those who don't know, was like a Spanish noble who was a military leader, kind of officer, was very, lived his life of pleasure, was all about the glory, achieving the honor of battle. And he actually fought, I can't remember which war it was, one of those in like the 1400s or whatnot. And he basically got his leg blowed up by a cannonball. So not very fun. It actually like caused him, like he had like, I think he had to like have a cane and at least had like a limp for the rest of his life. But he was actually recovering over, I think it was a monastery or like a nunnery in Spain. And, here he is unable to move. And all he had was the scriptures and the stories of the saints. And what like Ignatius started to do, because what else are you going to do when you have a broke leg and in like 15th century healthcare system, but lay on the bed and read about these stories of Jesus and about the saints who came after. And what he started to do is imagine himself in those situations, being with the disciples. What would it be like to encounter Jesus? What would it be like to live these lives of the saints? And as he did that, he kind of had a gradual kind of conversion experience. He decided from that he wanted to give his life to God. He wanted what he saw as a life of glory and honor through military conquest. He now saw a new narrative in the scripture and the story and the traditions of the church, which was about glory through honor to God, through love of neighbor, through union with Christ's example. And so the act of Ignatian spirituality is just that. It's about becoming united in the reality of Jesus, the incarnation, which is about not just, bringing your mind to it, but is about bringing your whole soul, bringing your body, where we live out that new reality. And it's all this holistic, integrated idea of spirituality that you're bringing your whole self into these narratives. And so when we engage in ancient spirituality, it's all with this idea of becoming united with the divine, and not just, intellectually or even just spiritually, but spirituality in the sense of our whole selves, which actually puts us out into the world and be able to live into that new reality that, in scripture, especially, and in the person of Christ, Jesuits and Ignatians and Catholics and, Christians tend to see as the summation of, what is reality, which is, the incarnation, and ultimately the Trinity too. So I apologize to my Jesuit professors if I left out key, aspects of that. I'm sorry. So there you go.
No
Feel
worries.
free to comment any additions or subtractions to what I said.
Yeah, I think that I want to lift up this concept of embodiment, right? We are kind of getting our whole self, and that's something that you kind of said a few times, but it's getting our physical bodies ingrained and then becoming aware of how our bodies respond to what we're imagining as well. So what we're going to do and how we're going to adapt to this to practice it with the Dragon Prince is we're going to listen to a 30-second clip of the Dragon Prince that we have already selected for us. And what we're going to do is we're going to imagine ourselves into this scene. And when you imagine yourself into the scene, you can imagine yourself as a third party member. You can just be like a fly on the wall, a person who's present and listening. You can imagine yourself into one of the characters that is speaking. You can imagine yourself into someone who is not present, but how another character that if they did overhear this conversation, how they might experience it. And when we imagine, I want us to be keenly aware of not only what our brain is doing, but also how is our body reacting? What are our senses telling us? What am I getting hot? Am I getting cold? Is my breath speeding up? Am I tasting something, smelling something? What is everything that is happening with our body? And so it's cultivating awareness around that so that we might become a little bit more informed. And so both Trevor and I are going to imagine ourselves into the scene, and we're going to reflect on our experience. And then we hope that you're doing the same at home. And so in order to prepare you that, I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit of a rundown. This is a scene from episode 1 where Callum is talking to Eugene about magic. And so I just wanted to invite you into that. If you want to, you can find a place. If you're listening in the car, I don't recommend doing this, but everybody else, and if you're in a safe place to do so, I recommend closing your eyes, taking a deep breath, and then imagining yourself into this scene.
I love this. I love learning about magic. But I want you to teach me to do some moon magic. Maybe some hands-on learning. We get in there, you show me how to do a moonbeam, a moon ray, a moon shine.
Humans can't do magic.
But I did do magic.
Right, with a primal stone. But then you smashed it, so now you're just a standard human again. But look on the bright side, you've got those extra fingers, the little ones. What do you call them? Pinkos.
But I know other humans who do magic.
We do not call that practice magic.
Give yourself a minute to come out of that experience. Stay tuned with your body. What did you notice? All right. So, Trevor, we're going to start with you. I kind of want to just get a sense of who first did you imagine yourself as? Were you a fly on the wall? Were you a character? And then kind of tell us a little bit about your experience imagining yourself into this scene?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think just kind of by default, I lean more towards. I really empathize with Callum, just because his experience I really relate to, and especially here because, you know, Callum just discovered that he could do all these cool things, having grown up thinking he couldn't really do a whole lot. He couldn't do fighting. He couldn't do the chivalrous things that was kind of expected of him as the, well, I guess, stepson of the king, but in the court, no matter, or in the court regardless. And that actually like really resonated with me because growing up in a place where it was all sports, football, making really good grades, all these different kind of extracurricular things that you're supposed to like subscribe to be successful and to be like of worth. I wasn't really good at any of those, and a lot of that plays to my ADHD and also my unathleticness. But kind of like Callum, he discovers this new way of being able to be in the world and found something he could do well at and is excited about that. And for me, that was a lot of actually how my interest in like theology and spirituality, what that kind of gave me. I was real active with church things. I was starting to read a lot and actually understanding it. Like I felt smart for the first time as someone who didn't make the best grades in school because of, you know, ADHD, and who felt productive doing this. And just kind of like how Callum was, it made me feel like a sense of control. And so I'm real excited wanting to do this, do that, do this with my newfound gift of theology and being in church. But the issue is that I was using it more for myself and myself feeling of worth, which to an extent I think spirituality does, but it was more of just like a tool for me to prop myself up. And I think that's kind of what Callum in this scene is struggling with. And I just really, really resonated with that because as we kind of see, this ends up being kind of an issue for Callum, and ultimately a little bit of a thing that could potentially lead him to using dark magic. And I can see spirituality in the same way in theology. Like it's cool and everything, and I'm good at it, but it doesn't matter if I'm using it for the wrong reasons. I'm not using it to build others up, to build the kingdom of God in terms of my specific tradition, not to just build up myself. So yeah, that's kind of where my mind went listening to that.
Yeah, I'm it's so cool that, you know, 30 seconds can inspire what you just said, right? And like thinking about it in a new way, in a different way, can inspire that kind of thought. And I think that's why these practices are so cool. So I want to tell you about how I imagine myself into it, and then I want to get your feedback, because I think that because I flitted between both Callum and Lujane, and I was Lujane at first because Callum was like, I'm super happy. This is like, I'm like giddy that I'm going to be able to do this. And then Lujane's like, no. And there's this phrase that she utters that I felt, because we just came off of this conversation talking about Grin and Viren, where I think Lujane in this moment is channeling that Viren energy, if you will. I'm putting up air quotes of that judgmental, critical, like, nope, this isn't possible. Whereas Callum's living in this like open, imaginary, vulnerable place, and she shuts him down. She's like, no, you're still you're just a standard human, but you have some pinkos, which is like that that like false optimism, if you will, right? And I was sitting there going like, oh God, that's me. And I was like, that's something I do. And so in my body, I was like a little crestfallen. I felt like a little tension in my chest there, because I was like, oh no, like my awareness is turning on. I guess that's a step in the like TO process, right? It's like, oh, that is potentially a way that I have responded before.
Right.
So can I ask you this? When you heard that as while you were experiencing Callum there, when Lujane said, you know, you're just a standard human, how did your body react? What did you experience?
Especially coming from Protestant circles, you know, they're real big into the idea of this total depravity, you know, that like there is something, exactly, that there's something inherently wrong with you, but thank God for Jesus because he can overlook all that, you know, and hey, you still got, you know, you got pinkos, you know, and there's still some cool things, but there's still something inherently flawed with you. And I understand, you know, there's a sense where we understand why that's sort of the assumption made by, like, you know, Zadians, you know, because humans haven't really demonstrated otherwise, and they have demonstrated a lack of magic and a disconnection from the magic that is like, well, this must just be the reality, just as much as a reality as like war and conflict is. And so I think a lot of times when we try use this idea of like everybody's a sinner, you know, oh, we're depraved and stuff, and in a sense and I know people that have like the best intentions, and I do believe humanity, you know, often chooses wrong a lot and gives every reason to make people think that there is no hope, you know.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when you limit people within those, you know, identities that like you're inherently flawed and nothing you can do will change that, then you sort of limit the inherent goodness in that person, because, you know, Christians still believe we're made in the image of God, you know, which implies that we were made to be good. And we see with Callum that he's eventually able to do magic, which just kind of like threw that theory out of the window, you know, that humans can't do magic.
Yeah.
And it was all because he refused to let that narrative that, you know, my humanity is, even though it, you know, is flawed in a sense, doesn't have to define my future.
Yeah.
You know, and when you limit it to this inherent sense of depravity, you don't allow for that chance to grow and to be remade and brought closer to our original true nature.
Yeah.
Which is ultimately what we are, is we are made good.
Hear, hear. Yeah, y'all, that was a full like segment there on 30 seconds of audio, right? And so isn't this a neat little experiment that we get to try and learn from just a short portion? I think that's super neat. I want to invite our listeners, if this was an exercise that was that you kind of practiced at home, feel free to send us a voicemail of your experience to thearkofe@gmail.com. We would love to get a voicemail and listen to it and potentially share it on the podcast if you'd let us. Just a thought, putting that out there. You can also find us on, we haven't talked about this yet, but like, you know, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all the things, BNB_pod. Join us. Come and see what we're like. Join our Facebook group. Talk about it. You know, all the things. Okay. So that kind of brings us to a close on our second practice. I think we'll do one more, and we'll be back with that in a few seconds. Welcome back to our final spiritual practice for this episode. You'll note that this is a little bit of a longer episode, but we just couldn't get away. We wanted to make sure we got these three practices in because they're all so rich and full, and I wanted to take advantage of Trevor's time, but you know, maybe he'll come back. We'll see. So what we're going to do this time for our third practice for the episode is called Florilegium. And florilegium is a neat little practice where what we're doing is a florilegia is essentially like, these are the flowers that are blooming from the text. These are like little sparklets that spoke to us. And a lot of times we keep favorite quotes and things like that. And this is just a way of viewing them as, what if these quotes are sacred in and of themselves? What if these little sparklets could give us more? And the way we kind of go about this practice is, I have my sparklets, Trevor has his sparklets, and then you all as listeners have your own sparklets. And theoretically what happens is, when we put them in conversation with one another, we get something new and something that we can learn and grow from. And it's a nice little piece of fruit that we can pick. So we're gonna try it. How's that sound, Trevor?
I am excited. I've never done this practice before, but I'm excited, and just got to do it with my good friend Ben.
Sweet. So theoretically, we have both come with a quote. So do you mind sharing what quote you have chosen so that we can kind of grapple with that?
Yeah. So my quote is from the King in episode 5 of season 2. And it goes, "We will share whatever we have with them, and we will share in their suffering."
Ooh, that's a lot. That's already a lot there.
Yeah, nothing heavy or anything.
Yeah, we could do a lot with that one alone. Okay. All right. So mine is from episode 4, and it's from Callum right at the very beginning. He says, "What? No way. I am extremely attuned to slight changes in the airflow." So what we have are 2 of these wonderful sparklets that we've pulled from the text. And what I want to do now is, before we kind of give our reasons for why this spoke to us, why they sparkled in such a way, I want to go into the first iteration of the practice, which is where we read them sequentially and see how they relate to one another. And then after that, we'll kind of parse out why we chose them, why they stuck out to us. And then we will flip the quotes and see in a new way and see if it shines differently. So I'm going to read both of these quotes together. And so, Trevor, as you hear these, I want you to imagine them in conversation with one another. Here we go. "We will share whatever we have with them, and we will share in their suffering." What? No way. I'm extremely attuned to slight changes in the airflow. So as you hear those in conversation with one another, what comes to mind? What is it saying to you?
It actually kind of, for me, ties to a lot of the context of the first part of the quote scene that it was made, because it seems like he's like, in the same way that a little bit that like Viren was saying, in response of like, no, we don't need to share in suffering. Look, I can do this. I have this skill. I'm extremely attuned to these slight changes in airflow, which seems to imply, hey, we can do this instead. But as we kind of learn from that whole situation, that is, that sort of mentality is kind of what causes, so many problems to happen, even though they do find a kind of a loophole to fix the situation of the starving citizens, by basically, taking that lava monster's heart, that there was extreme loss from that, and it's definitely illustrated as not having been the, ideal way. Just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you should. And sometimes, even if you have the ability to do something, doesn't mean the cost of it, is worth doing.
I do. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's interesting to me what universal that response is. What? No way. I'm extremely attuned to slight changes in the airflow. It's like, oh, you are? Because immediately they fall out of the sky, right? It's one of those things where it's one of those things, like, anytime someone claims to just know something, whether and anytime certainty, and we kind of touched on this earlier, but anytime certainty comes into play, it feels like the phrase "pride cometh before the fall" comes to mind, right? And fall literally in this case, but it's one of those things where when we appear certain, we are going to eat our words, right? And it's interesting because I feel like, why is our gut response to respond with certainty? Like, can you help me illuminate that? Like, I don't understand why. Like, I get it intellectually. Let's be real. Like, I understand why we crave certainty, because wouldn't it be nice if things could be certain? But at the same time, like, why is that our response when like 99% of the time we're wrong?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's about control, you know? It gives us a sense of control over our own lives versus saying, I may or may not die today. Like, I may or may not know what's really going on in the world.
Yeah.
That's a scary thought. And kind of tied into vulnerability, it requires a sort of vulnerability to it,
Yeah.
you know, to say, I don't know what's going on. And you lose that sense of control that you had over your own life, over the understanding we have of the universe. It gives us it gives us a sense of like we can rationalize what's happening, and at the very least we can understand it, and that makes me feel more comfortable about what the universe is like, when, you know, in reality we can't know what's going on, and really we're pretty insignificant when it comes to the vastness of life and the cosmos, you know, and that's a scary thought for a lot of people.
Terrifying. Oh, okay. So this has kind of been our first orientation of these two quotes together. Before we dive into our second orientation where we flip them, I would love to kind of get a sense of like, why did this sparkle? Why did your quote sparkle to you? What about it called you to write it down?
Yeah, to me, it seemed like a very, especially for like King Harrow, seemed like a very relevant response to even contemporary issues today.
Yeah.
You know, like so often we want to solve problems by force or some creative intellectual loophole, which sometimes can work, but, you know, a lot of times there are only so much you can control. And, you know, I think like people in AA get this, because it's the idea of like, you know, when they say the serenity prayer, help me accept the things I can't control and change the things I can, or, you know, I'm butchering the quote, but there is a sense, you know, where that is true. But at the same time, even if you can't control something, doesn't mean you can do nothing. You know, it's not just being like, oh, well, we can't fix this, we can't do anything, we're powerless in this situation. There is a sense in like, at least we can share in this suffering.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that's the best response to things. If someone's going to suffer and we can't do anything about it, well, let's at least stand in solidarity with them.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense. I appreciate that a lot. Okay. So for me, my quote, it stuck out to me. I went through a quick run on. I went through the whole season this morning, and it was on in the background while I was doing other things. And I paused when Callum said this, because I was like, like, it's like, dude, you didn't need to do that. Like, so this is right. He comes out, he's like, Rayla's poking fun at him because he's meditating on the Sky Arcanum, and because they're flying in the air, he's like, I can do this. I'm going to become attuned. And he's like, I already am attuned. And then they fall out of the sky. And it's just like, dude, like, I think often when we're chasing something that we really truly want, we don't give ourselves the grace and the mercy is the word that's coming to mind, but like we don't allow ourselves to take baby steps when we're learning something new. Like when I want to learn how to play the piano, and then like students will come to a lesson and be like, I want to play this, and I'm like, you can't play that for like another year. Like like it's one of those things where like you have to learn the basics before you can jump to the big stuff. And I think that often we have this presumption. You know what this is actually reminding me of? It's reminding me of Zuko in episode 1 of Avatar: The Last Airbender, where he's talking to Iroh, and Iroh is saying, or no, Zuko's like, teach me the next form. And Iroh's like, no. And he's like, you will teach me the next form. And he's like, all right, after I finish my food. But it's one of those things where like it's this presumption that we know what's best for us when we don't. We like, and it's like, we crave and we believe and we like, we know so hard. And then it turns out we knew something that was totally wrong. And that's what this quote reminded me of, that feeling. And I know, pun intended, that, you know, I've experienced that many a time, and I know that I'll experience it again. But again, it's just working with that. So I found it to be a really universal moment and very apt. That's why I picked mine.
Yeah. Well, and that's a really interesting insight too, because especially as like living in Western capitalist culture where it's all about pull yourself up the bootstraps, be all you can, do this, do that, and you will be successful and finally be of worth. That's a narrative that a lot of us are ingrained to. So I think, I love that reasoning behind that quote.
Yeah. Okay, so what we've done now is we've got a sense of why we picked them, and now we know why the other person picked them, right? And so as we re-flip these quotes on their heads, we might get a different meaning by putting them together in a new way. So let's engage here. I'll read it for us. What? No way. I'm extremely attuned to slight changes in the airflow. We will share whatever we have with them, and we will share in their suffering. As you've kind of grappled with these new quotes and this new orientation, is there anything new that is coming to you by hearing the quotes in this way? And I can go first because I have something that came up really quickly.
Yeah, go for it, please.
So for me, one of the things that you've mentioned vulnerability a few times in our conversation, and what I'm noticing is a very dichotomous. There's a binary between these two in terms of the amount of vulnerability. One is saying, nope, I'm invulnerable. And the other is saying, we will choose vulnerability. And I think that is the stark difference, especially based off what you were saying and why you picked it. That's what jumped out to me in this orientation. It's like, no vulnerability. And the other one's like, nope, we're going to choose vulnerability. Like this is the lesson. We're going to do it, and it's going to be hard. And it's like, and that's what it is. It's exactly what it's saying. We'll choose we will share whatever we have with them, and we will share in their suffering. And to choose suffering is to say, listen, I'm going to be vulnerable here. And I would like to think that would be my response. And I know that it would not be my gut reaction. And so that's kind of what came to my mind as I grappled with this new orientation. How about you? Has anything come up that is new for you?
Absolutely, actually, yeah. And kind of as you were saying, I started to see it this way, and I don't know how much is connected with what you said, but I looked at how the first line, I noticed, where it's saying, I am extremely attuned to slight changes in the airflow. And then Hera's quote comes in, we will share whatever we have with them, and we will share in their suffering. And so it has this view, this assumption of like at the beginning, I have to be the one to do this. It's all about me. But Hera's response with that quote, it reframes it from the I to the we. And I will say that's one thing that some forms of spirituality, regardless of denomination or religion, I think have a struggle with, is like turning it into just about me.
Yeah.
And not seeing that once we find how we ourselves are connected to the divine, how we are connected to one another, because ultimately that's divinity in every person and every aspect of creation. And especially, I mentioned like our Western capitalist culture, where you can go and buy like a spirituality book at like the Walgreens, as if it's just like another, as if it's just another thing to consume, and adapt according to your life for your own individual, spirituality. You sort of miss the point of spirituality in the sense it's supposed to bring us closer together, and it's supposed to redefine who we are and how we are bound to one another. I love I've watched Doctor Strange recently, the Marvel movie.
Yeah.
And I was really blown away by this moment whenever the master, I forgot who the master was, but Doctor Strange's master is like dying. And she talked about like his problem and how he was so obsessed with his success and his self, and his ambition, and how that even translates a little into his magic. And she's like, and you forgot the most important thing. And he's like, what? She's like, it's not about you. And that sort of realization is the point I think that spirituality is supposed to do. It's not just about you. It's about all of this and what you can do to be a part of that. So yeah, that's where my mind went.
No, I think that's really important, right? Is how do we focus on, like, because we are constantly focused on what about me? What is my purpose? What is my? And it's like, we need to venture down that path in order to understand how we fit into the we. So if we just stop at the me and the my and the I, that's only part of the journey, right? We have to continue and expand past that into a collective to see. And I love how you phrased it. It's seeing, I think you said it's seeing God in every human, but also every aspect of creation, right? It's not just in humanity. God is everywhere, right? Yeah. And I think that's a really integral piece to experiencing the world. And I won't go off on a tangent, but I wrote a paper for one of my final papers was on seeing the image of God, not just in humanity, but also everywhere else, and in animals and in the earth and in the creation. And I think that's kind of integral to treating everything with dignity and living.
Well, and we see this with Callum towards the end of the season when he has that realization about the primal stone, and he says to Rayla, this isn't something, I realize that the primal stone isn't something that I hold, it's something that I'm in. And kind of talks this idea that the spirituality around him is not something that he can harness and use and control for his own gains, but is actually something that he's a part of and is like a state of being that connects him with every living thing in the world.
I'm really loving this metaphor that I'm like, it's still tenuous at best, but I'm really grappling with this idea of magic being like, what if magic was a metaphor for spirituality, and dark magic is this capitalistic version of religion, whereas the primal magic is like seeing ourselves as a part of a collective whole.
Exactly.
Right? Oh, I just got chills. Ooh.
Ooh. That's
okay.
The chills mean you got something right. That means you got something right.
Yeah, that's dang. Oh man, I wish I'd like intended that, but it just kind of happened. Dang. Okay, but okay, this is why we do this, right? We're getting inklings and pictures and images of what spirituality and how we fit into it really is. And so this has been a practice in Florilegia. So thanks for indulging me as we engage with these various practices.
Absolutely.
All right. That was our final practice for the episode. But what we're going to do now is venture forth into another little musical interlude, and we'll come on back with our Lens MVP for the whole season. And then some gratitude that we'll share as well. And for the Lens MVP, we're going to decide on what that lens will be very shortly, but you'll hear when we come back. our final segment for our episode on all of our spiritual practices for book 2 of The Dragon Prince. We are excited because what we're about to dive into is what we've been doing for the whole season, which is the lens MVP and then doing some gratitude, because gratitude is great. So, Trevor, if you were to put a word to maybe our whole conversation, or to like something that like spoke to you from all of book 2, what's a lens that, or a word, or an idea that spoke to you, that jumped out at you from the entire season? Is there anything that speaks out?
We've been saying a lot, but I see vulnerability. You know, is a big.
I love it.
You know, and so much of it can be looked through that. You know, I interpret a lot of it as I'm thinking about it through that lens, you know, in terms of like what is, you know, healthy and what is unhealthy for the characters.
I love it. Let's do it. Let's grapple with that.
All right, sounds good.
If we were to pick one character then, and you're going to nominate someone and I'm going to nominate someone, who has been the most vulnerable, or who has taught vulnerability best, or who has, in your mind, engaged with vulnerability the best in terms of your MVP?
So I'm going to go and say, I think Ezrin for this, because, you know, like in terms of who is the most consistently, one, he's a child, you know, which I think is some of the point, that like a child is able to embrace more vulnerability. And still be illustrated as in a lot of ways stronger than the adults, and doing a lot more, being more king-like even. And especially like whenever he hears the news of his father's death, he feels for it, you know, and obviously he, you know, is upset, but because he's vulnerable and has this new understanding of what the world is supposed to be, you know, and has these values of love and forgiveness, and this relationship with Zim that he has, and how he's able to look at the world through the lens of those relationships, that he's able to understand that, hey, I'm the king now. I'm have a responsibility, and that's a very mature thing. And the fact that he's shown as so much mature but vulnerable, because he's also a kid having fun with Zim, very emotional, able to really be on a really deep, intimate, personal level with his friends, just shows just how powerful that vulnerability is. And how he's able to be the ideal king because of it.
I also, what comes to mind is there's this moment where Callum tries to tell him about Harrow earlier on, and he then goes on this admission of like, I know the world's counting on me, I can't train Zim how to fly, and then he just like he just is so willing and able to share what is on what his burden is, that other people, as we age, we tend to do less and less. And I say that very generally. Some people are phenomenal at it, but I think culture has cultivated a situation where that becomes less and less possible. And he just does it so well, and it's just so admirable. So I think that's a fine nomination. I think that's an excellent choice. So I'm gonna go in a different direction. And bear with me here. I'm gonna pick Soren.
Okay, I can. Okay, I'm interested to hear. Yeah, because I think I might agree.
Okay. All right. So there's a saying that if you do not, vulnerability is going to guide your actions and decisions, whether you like it or not. And it is one of those things where either you are going to choose vulnerability and you are going to act in according to with your vulnerable feelings, or vulnerability is going to force you to do things that you do not want to do. And Soren, for the first half of this season, is letting vulnerability guide, like his avoidance of vulnerability is guiding his actions, right? Because he does not want to kill the princes. He's actively uninterested in doing it because he's feeling this burden of pleasing his father. And he is so enmeshed in not letting that hurt him that he is letting vulnerability guide his actions in a way that he probably wouldn't want them to go. And then this moment where he is lying on this bed and he is paralyzed, and I just got chills again. He is talking to Claudia and he admits and tells her what Viren asked him to do. And Claudia is like, nope, not true, you're lying. And like goes on, like has a little bit of a freak out, and she ends up getting tossed out of the building. But Soren just feels so liberated by it. And so that moment is really, when I heard vulnerability, I was like, that's a vulnerable moment right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, I was like,
well, there's nothing more vulnerable than being in a state where you cannot move your entire body. You know, you have literally no control over the one thing you should have control over, you know? Yeah. And he accepts it, honestly. He's ready to go write poems.
Yeah, like he is so exceptional at it. And I just like, and I say that with no irony at all, because like I love every poem that he attempts, and you know, for better or for worse. But okay, so those are our nominations. And so what I'm going to ask you all to do is, if you're listening, when this releases to the feed, we are going to have a little Twitter battle here, and we're going to say, which one do you think deserves the actual award for MVP for vulnerability? Is it Trevor's nomination of Ezran, or is it my nomination for Soren? And I will not be upset if I lose, because I was also thinking of Ezran as well. So, but you should vote for me anyway, because I like winning and I'm competitive. I mean, Soren, not for me. You should vote for Soren anyway, because I'm competitive. Anyway, that's that. If you want to nominate someone for the Lens of VP and have them involved in the a Twitter battle, we can also play your nomination. And so send it in at thearkofe@gmail.com. Try to keep your voice memo down to 2 minutes or less. 2 minutes or less. Okay. And that kind of brings us to our final segment, Trevor. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to go all the way to this point with you. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, I've enjoyed the journey.
I'm learning a lot from you. This is wonderful. So our last segment is gratitude, and gratitude is, I like to think about this as, this is a moment or a character that has blessed us in some way. And when I say that, I mean that they have given us something, they've taught us something, that we have learned from them, that we see something in them that makes us feel all warm and fuzzy inside, whatever it is, but they have blessed us with something. And I would love to hear who you are grateful for from this season.
Anya. I am gracious for Anya. Because the moment she's able to hear the story of her mother's, you know, trying to take a stand and be the best queen she can be, and Viren kind of thinking that if he can just make her empathize and see the past as it was, that she'll make the responsible decision. And most adults would probably, you know, because under Viren's assumption, most adults who would hear that would finally see his way. But she doesn't allow the past to, you know, define her actions. And that's a very mature in the fact that she's like a child. Like,
she's more mature than I am. Let's be real.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, it gives you like a sense of hope. Like, wow, like the world should be like that, you know, where even our kids can look at this and say, you know what, this happened. These things happened in our past, and they're realities that we have to deal with, but they don't have to define how we go forward now. Because it's ultimately nothing would change without that moment that she demonstrated.
Yeah, no, she's a powerhouse of an awesome human being. That's all I'm saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Good choice. I love that. That's a great person to be grateful for.
I wanted to bring her in somehow, so I'm grateful that like you had this, because I felt like I could bring her in like with that. So
yeah, gratitude. This is why we're here. Gratitude, right?
It's all about gratitude.
For me, I mean, I've had the opportunity to be grateful for in every episode so far, and so I'm thinking about like, is there a different angle that our conversation today has given me? And I think that often I am not grateful for Viren, because I am often like critical of Viren. I'm critical, and because I see this path, especially knowing where he's going in season 3, that I'm like, oh no, this is bad news all the time, everywhere. But I want to tell you about why I'm grateful. There's this moment where he is looking into the mirror, and Erebos has pulled out his little box of like sus tools, where he has like his goblet, he has his knife, and all these things. And Erebos, spoiler alert, is in the mirror and holding up this dagger, and he's about to cut his hand. And Viren's like, nope, I need to think about this. And to this point, I'm like, dude, you haven't been thinking about this yet? Dude, there's so much going down, and you need to be thinking about what's going on. I'm sitting here going like, what are you doing? But that moment where he's like, I need to seriously consider whether I'm willing to go down this rabbit hole.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm grateful for that moment in particular, because it showed me that this is, that I can trust him more, right? Mm-hmm. And it's counterintuitive, I guess, but like that I see the humanity in him. It humanized him in a way that really allowed me to live into seeing that he is just as divine as either you or me, and that we are just as capable as making decisions the way that he did. And so I'm grateful for that humility check, if you will.
Yeah, there's a sense of like Viren's the most like reflectively human of
God.
Because there, I know, yeah, and it's scary. Like I could, like you said, I can see myself being Viren. I've thought like Viren, like if we don't think practically and utilitarian, then injustice is just going to continue, and you can't be weak in light of it. And I'm really interested to see if they do more on like Viren's backstory, because I feel like there's a lot of interesting development of how he got there. That's just going to make me feel for him even more.
Yeah, I feel like they have to. There's definitely some things that are big underlying questions of that haven't been answered yet. So I'm excited. Season 4, y'all.
Season 4.
It is in production, which is exciting. No date yet, but it is definitely happening. Okay. This has been a really awesome experience. I just want to thank you again for being present with me and engaging in this vulnerable space, right?
Yeah. No, this has been the highlight of many months, honestly, of activities. This was really fun. I figured it was going to be a good time going in, but actually going through and experiencing it, I'm just like, I'm so glad to have done this. And awesome. I'm so grateful for the invitation. I only hope that I was able to contribute just an ounce of what, the experience I had,
No worries. I'm certain that our listeners will get some joy out of all of this. Okay, well, everyone, you have been listening to Bending Not Breaking with Ben Pruitt and Trevor Warren, and we are so excited that you've been with us. I want to take this opportunity to invite you all to find us on Patreon to help us continue to make episodes like this. You can support us at BNB_pod, and at any donation you see fit. Lots of cool bonus episodes with live episodes once a month. We have Facebook group you can join, early episodes. We have bonus episodes that go up on the Patreon. For instance, this one's going to show up on Patreon before it comes out on the real feed, about probably 2 months before it actually goes out on the real feed. And then there's going to be lots of cool other stuff. So check it out, BNB_pod. Remember all the things on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all the social medias. I want to thank the Ark of E for hosting our podcast. I want to thank Alex Mayfield. I want to thank Max Gongaware and Noah Blanchard for helping us with the podcast. And until next time, be well and do good.